It's all bad news, I'm afraid. Last week, the Tate's new rehang dumped paintings like Waterhouse's Lady of Shalott in the name of inclusivity. This week, the National Trust has announced it's preparing a policy for the restitution of colonial artefacts. But what does that mean? I don't know about you, but after the National Trust produced what looked to me like a poorly researched naughty list of historical properties, I don't exactly trust them with that heritage that they're supposed to be caring for. The Trust has over 1,000 items from South and East Asia in its care. Some of these are at Powys Castle in Wales, the family seat of Clive of India and his son Edward. Born in 1725, Clive was the first governor of Bengal. His son, Edward, was the governor of Madras, and one of the objects in question is a portion of a sultan's tent taken in battle. But now the Indian government are turning up the heat, with Modi demanding the so-called repatriation of artefacts, I think not without cynical political motives either. You may not know this, but in January, a museum in Glasgow was the first, giving a 14th century sword to India. The Horniman Museum in South London sent 72 artefacts to Nigeria, and the Charity Commission, dismissing objections, gave permission to the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology to hand over more than 100 artefacts to Nigeria. The list goes on. And quietly, behind closed doors, our museums are being undermined by naïve, guilt-ridden curators who are treating artefacts as if they were their own private property, within their rights to just give away. The reality is, this repatriation business is not as clear-cut as they're making out. Let's look at the Benin bronzes, for example. When Germany sent the bronzes back to Nigeria, they reportedly did so on the guarantee that they would be on public display. Instead, they ended up in the hands of the King of Benin, whose ancestors, get this, were slave traders who commissioned the bronzes. When the bronzes were taken, the Kingdom of Benin was one of the most brutal slaving nations in the world. Well over 100,000 slaves passed through ports controlled by the Benin slave traders on their way to America. As the historian Robert Toombs has pointed out, the British expedition in which the bronzes were taken actually led to the abolition of the slave trade in Benin. And that was a response to the massacre of unarmed Brits and African porters. The right of the King of Benin to these artefacts is also disputed, including by a group of African-American descendants of slaves who filed a lawsuit to stop the Smithsonian Museum from returning bronzes to Nigeria. And what about that literal jewel in the crown, the Kohinoor diamond? It was legally gifted to Queen Victoria by the child Maharaja of Punjab, though admittedly he had little choice in the matter. But does the modern state of India have a right to it? After it was extracted by slave labour under a Hindu dynasty, it entered the hands of their Muslim successors. It was first recorded in the 16th century in the possession of the first Mughal emperor, before it was taken in the 18th century by an Iranian conqueror. When he was assassinated, it ended up in the hands of one of his generals who became the ruler of the new Afghan dynasty. A Sikh ruler then came to own it after he had helped the Afghan king to retake his throne. These are all points that have been highlighted by the British Indian historian Zarir Masani. So who has claim? India, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan? Should it go to the central government or should it go to the state government of Punjab? Or perhaps to the descendants of the last Punjab king who settled here in England? One of the most insulting repatriations of all, I think, was Durham University's decision to return a Japanese flag taken during the Second World War as part of a decolonisation, diversification and repatriation drive. What a disgrace. What an insult to people like my grandfather who were starved and tortured in Japanese prison camps. But that just goes to show how warped our thinking has become. It shows just how historically illiterate and reductive their vision of history is. And if we don't fight this tooth and nail, our museums will lie empty. Should every object be returned to its first identifiable geographic provenance? Artifacts will be handed over to whoever shouts the loudest or whoever has the most geopolitical clout, to the detriment of future generations and academic study. Remember when a curator wrote a paper shared with staff at one of our most prestigious museums that claimed that, quote, museums were put in place to legitimize racist ideology? Do you trust these people? People who hold their own institutions in contempt, who see the artifacts that are in their care as something to be purged and insulted, as weapons in a culture war that they instigated. The truth is, the nation simply cannot trust the National Trust. The chairman of the National Trust said that in creating a policy on restitution, the organisation will, quote, will be following the advice that has been given to all organisations by the Museums Association and the Arts Council. He added, I understand these are huge issues. Provenance needs to come into it. Public access, public benefit, all of those questions. The Museums Association says the repatriation or restitution of museum items can be a powerful cultural, spiritual and symbolic act which recognises past wrongs.